Chapter 1: The Edge of Nowhere, Life on the Flannan Isles. Welcome to this journey into one of the most enduring mysteries in maritime history. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you are watching from and the exact time at which you are listening to this narration. We are interested in knowing which places and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach you, because what you are about to hear is not fiction. It is not exaggeration. It is not folklore embellished over time. This is a documented historical event that has never been explained, a mystery that has haunted Scotland for over 125 years, a disappearance so complete, so inexplicable, that it has become legend. 21 miles west of the Isle of Lewis, in Scotland's Outer Hebrides, rising from the cold Atlantic like broken teeth, lie the Flannan Isles, 7 jagged fragments of rock, swept by storms, surrounded by seas that have claimed countless ships. In Scottish Gaelic, they are called Na Aileanan Flannach, the Islands of Flannan, named for Saint Flannan, a 7th century Irish bishop who supposedly sought solitude there. No one has ever lived permanently on these islands. No one could. They are too remote, too hostile, too inhospitable for human habitation. But in December of 1900, 3 men vanished from the largest of these islands without a trace, and to this day, no one knows why. The Flannan Isles Lighthouse stands on Island Moor, the Big Island, though that name is relative. The island is barely half a mile long, a mass of volcanic rock rising 288 feet above the crashing waves. Its cliffs are sheer, its surface treeless, its weather brutal. The lighthouse itself is a testament to Victorian engineering and determination. Designed by David Allen Stevenson, member of the famous Stevenson family of lighthouse engineers, which included Robert Louis Stevenson's father, it was built between 1895 and 1899 at a cost of nearly $2,000, an enormous sum for the time. Construction was a nightmare. Every stone, every tool, every bag of cement had to be hauled up 150-foot cliffs from supply boats tossing in dangerous seas. Workers carved steps into the rock face, 160 of them leading from a precarious landing platform to the island's summit. They built a railway track to move materials. They blasted into solid rock to create foundations. The lighthouse itself rises 75 feet, its walls 3 feet thick, designed to withstand the worst that the Atlantic could throw at it. And the Atlantic tried. During a gale just 1 month after the light was first exhibited, on December 7, 1899, waves came completely over the island, over 300 feet above sea level, washing away a crane and causing massive damage. But the lighthouse survived. Its powerful light, visible for 24 nautical miles, was designed to warn ships away from the treacherous rocks that had claimed so many vessels. It was a beacon of safety in one of the most dangerous stretches of water in the British Isles. To maintain this light, 3 keepers were required at all times. They lived in the lighthouse, in shifts lasting 2 to 4 weeks, isolated from the world, responsible for ensuring that the light never went dark. Their families lived at the shore station at Briescleed-on-Lewis, and every fortnight, weather permitting, a relief boat would arrive to rotate the keepers. It was a lonely, difficult life, but it was also essential, and the men who accepted these positions were experienced, reliable, professional. They had to be. Lives depended on that light. In December of 1900, 3 men were stationed at the Flannan Isles Lighthouse. Their names were James Ducat, Thomas Marshall, and Donald MacArthur. James Ducat was the principal keeper. At 43 years old, he was the most experienced member of the team. He had served with the Northern Lighthouse Board for years, working at various stations throughout Scotland. Those who knew him described him as steady, reliable, absolutely dependable. He was a family man, married with 4 children, and he took his responsibilities seriously. He kept meticulous records, maintained strict discipline, and ensured that the lighthouse operated to the highest standards. Ducat's logbooks from previous stations show a man who noticed everything: weather conditions, sea states, passing ships, maintenance needs. Nothing escaped his attention. He was exactly the kind of keeper you wanted in charge of a remote, dangerous station like Flannan. Thomas Marshall was the first assistant keeper. At 28 years old, he was younger than Ducat but already highly experienced. He had trained as a blacksmith before joining the lighthouse service, and he brought those practical skills to his work. He was known for his technical knowledge, his ability to repair equipment, his methodical approach to maintenance. Marshall was also a family man, married with 2 children. His wife Sarah later described him as cautious, careful, never one to take unnecessary risks. Thomas would check everything twice, she told investigators. He wasn't the sort to do anything foolish. The third keeper was Donald MacArthur, At 40 years old, he was older than Marshall, but less experienced at Flannan specifically. MacArthur was actually a replacement. He had been sent to cover for William Ross, who was on sick leave in December 1900. This was MacArthur's first rotation at Flannan, though he had years of lighthouse experience elsewhere. MacArthur was married with 2 children. His personnel file described him as competent and reliable, with good knowledge of lighthouse operations. He had been chosen specifically because of his experience and his ability to integrate quickly into a new team. These were not amateurs. These were not inexperienced men prone to panic or poor judgment. These were professional lighthouse keepers with years of training and experience. They knew the dangers. They knew the protocols. They knew how to survive in one of the harshest environments imaginable. And in December of 1900, all 3 of them vanished without explanation. To understand what happened at Flannan, you must first understand what life was like on that island. You must understand the isolation, the danger, the relentless hostility of the environment. The lighthouse stood alone on the summit of Island Moor, 288 feet above the Atlantic. Below, the sea crashed against volcanic cliffs with terrifying force. Even on calm days, rare at Flannan, the sound was constant, a deep booming that echoed through the rock itself. The lighthouse was reached by the landing platform at the eastern side of the island, where a concrete jetty had been built. From there, you climbed the 160 steps carved into the cliff face, a narrow, steep stairway with nothing but iron railings between you and a fatal fall. In rough weather, waves could sweep across these stairs, making the climb treacherous or impossible. At the top, a railway track led across the island's rocky surface to the lighthouse itself. This track had been built during construction to move materials, and the keepers used it to transport supplies from the landing platform. The lighthouse was self-contained. It had to be. On the ground floor was a storage room where fuel, food, water, and equipment were kept. Above that was the keepers' quarters, a kitchen, a living area, and sleeping spaces. Higher still were the lamp rooms, and finally at the top, the light itself, a rotating mechanism powered by clockwork with heavy weights that descended through the central shaft and had to be wound regularly. The keeper's routine was rigid. The light had to be lit at sunset and extinguished at sunrise. Throughout the night, one keeper was always on watch, monitoring the light, recording weather conditions, watching for ships in distress. During the day, there was maintenance, cleaning lenses, polishing reflectors, checking mechanisms, maintaining equipment, recording observations. Fresh water had to be conserved carefully. It was collected from rainfall and stored in tanks. Food was the preserved goods brought by the relief boat: tinned meat, dried fish, flour, coffee, tea. The keepers cooked for themselves, taking turns preparing meals in the small kitchen. Communication with the outside world was minimal. The lighthouse had no radio. Wireless technology was still in its infancy in 1900. The only contact with civilization came every fortnight when the relief boat arrived, bringing mail, supplies, newspapers, and occasionally rotating one of the keepers. In good weather, this isolation was manageable, but in winter, conditions at Flannan were brutal. Gales lasting days, waves that came completely over the island, rain that fell horizontally, temperatures near freezing, darkness that lasted 16 hours or more. And through it all, the light had to stay burning. It was by any measure one of the most challenging lighthouse posts in the British Isles. But James Ducat, Thomas Marshall, and Donald MacArthur were equal to the challenge. They had the experience, the training, and the temperament required. Until December 15th, 1900, when something happened that no amount of experience could prepare them for. In early December 1900, everything at Flannan Isle's lighthouse appeared normal. The relief boat had last visited on December 7th, the first anniversary of the lighthouse being lit. Joseph Moore, who would later discover the empty lighthouse, had rotated off, and Donald MacArthur had come on to replace William Ross. The 3 keepers, Ducat, Marshall, and MacArthur, settled into their routine. The weather was rough, as was typical for December in the Outer Hebrides. Gales swept across the Atlantic, battering the lighthouse with rain and wind. But this was nothing unusual. This was what they had been trained for. The lighthouse log from early December shows standard entries: weather observations, ships sighted, maintenance performed, the light functioning normally, nothing to suggest any problems or concerns. On December 12th, Ducat wrote in the log, "Severe winds from the west, sea extremely rough, cannot access landing platform due to wave action." This was routine. In winter, there were many days when the sea made the landing platform inaccessible. The keepers simply waited for calmer conditions. December 13th. Gale continuing. No vessels sighted. All mechanisms functioning normally. These would be the last official entries in the lighthouse log. On December 15th, the steamer Untouched, sailing from Philadelphia to Leith, passed the Flannan Isles around midnight. Captain Holman noted in the ship's log that the lighthouse was dark. The light was not burning. In poor weather, with dangerous seas, the light that was supposed to guide ships safely past the rocks was not there. Captain Holman made note of this irregularity, but he was on a scheduled voyage and could not investigate. When the Untouched docked at Leith on December 18th, he reported the dark lighthouse to the Northern Lighthouse Board. The board was concerned but not initially alarmed. Perhaps the light mechanism had failed and the keepers were working to repair it. Perhaps the extreme weather had damaged equipment. Lighthouse lights occasionally went dark temporarily due to mechanical failures. Repairs were made and service resumed. But this was different, because the scheduled relief was due on December 20th, and what the relief boat would discover would transform concern into horror and routine into mystery. What we know now, what investigators discovered later, is that people on Lewis had noticed something wrong before the Untouched passed. The lighthouse could be seen from certain points on Lewis, 21 miles away, on clear nights. And residents there later testified that they had not seen the light for several nights before December 15th. But this information did not reach the Northern Lighthouse Board until after the discovery. Communications in 1900 were slow, the Outer Hebrides were remote. People assumed that perhaps weather was blocking their view or that temporary repairs were being made. No one suspected the truth, because the truth was unthinkable. 3 experienced lighthouse keepers do not simply abandon their post. They do not leave the light dark. They do not vanish without explanation. The lighthouse service had operated for decades without such an incident. The protocols were clear. The men were trained. Nothing like this had ever happened before. But something had happened on Flannan, something that left no trace, no bodies, no note, no explanation. Just an empty lighthouse, a dark light, and 3 men gone as if they had never existed. The relief boat, the lighthouse tender Hesperus, was scheduled to depart for Flannan on December 20th. But a series of gales kept it trapped in port. Day after day, the weather made the passage impossible. The Hesperus could not sail. The keepers could not be relieved. And every day the light remained dark was another day of danger for ships navigating those treacherous waters. Finally, on December 26th, Boxing Day, the weather broke enough for the Hesperus to attempt the voyage. Captain James Harvey commanded the vessel. Joseph Moore, the relief keeper, was aboard, ready to rotate back onto the island for his turn. Moore was anticipating a routine relief. Perhaps he would hear about equipment failures that had kept the light dark. Perhaps the keepers would have stories about the recent storms. Perhaps they would be eager for news from shore after their extended rotation. He had no idea that he was about to make one of the most disturbing discoveries in lighthouse history. As the Hesperus approached Island Moore on that cold December morning, Captain Harvey tried to signal the lighthouse. Protocol required the keepers to acknowledge an approaching vessel by raising a flag. No flag was raised. The lighthouse remained silent, unresponsive. Harvey fired a flare, standard procedure when a lighthouse failed to respond. The flare arced into the gray sky and burst in a shower of light, and still no response from the lighthouse. Joseph Moore felt his first flicker of unease. But perhaps the keepers were inside. Perhaps they simply hadn't seen the ship approach. There were explanations. There had to be. The Hesperus maneuvered carefully toward the landing platform. The sea was calmer than it had been in weeks, but still dangerous. A small boat was launched, and Joseph Moore climbed aboard, along with 2 crew members. They rowed to the platform, secured the boat, and Moore began climbing the 160 steps to the lighthouse. He climbed slowly, carefully, on stones slick with spray. The lighthouse loomed above him, its windows dark. No smoke from the chimney, no sign of activity. The silence was wrong. Lighthouses were never silent. There were always sounds, voices, footsteps, the clang of equipment, the hum of the rotating mechanism. But as Joseph Moore reached the summit and approached the lighthouse door, he heard nothing. Nothing except the boom of waves against rock and the cry of seabirds. He reached the door. It was closed. Not locked, but closed. He pushed it open and stepped inside. And what Joseph Moore discovered in that lighthouse would haunt him for the rest of his life. Chapter 2. The Discovery, December 26th, 1900. Joseph Moore stood at the lighthouse door. His hand trembled slightly as he pushed it open. The hinges creaked, a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the silence. He called out, "Hello, Ducat, Marshal, MacArthur!" His voice echoed through the lighthouse. No response. Only the boom of distant waves and the cry of seabirds overhead. Moore stepped inside. The entrance hall was dark, but not completely black. Dim light filtered through windows higher up the tower. The air was cold, unnaturally cold, as if the building had been without heat for days. He moved deeper into the lighthouse, his footsteps echoing on stone floors. "Hello? Is anyone here?" Still nothing. No movement, no sound of human presence, just emptiness. Moore climbed the stairs to the keeper's quarters. Each step felt heavier than the last. Something was wrong, profoundly wrong, but he couldn't yet articulate what. He reached the living quarters. The door stood open. Moore stepped inside and stopped. The room was neat, too neat, orderly in a way that suggested abandonment rather than occupation. The kitchen table was set, but no food remained on plates. The stove was cold. The clock on the wall had stopped at 8:45, though whether morning or evening, Moore couldn't tell. Most disturbing were the oilskins. Lighthouse keepers kept their waterproof coats on hooks by the door, standard procedure so they could grab them quickly in emergencies. 3 sets should have been hanging there. 2 sets were on their hooks. 1 was missing. Moore's heart began to race. 2 men's coats still here, 1 gone. But where were the men themselves? He searched the entire lighthouse, every room, every level, storage areas, the lamp room, the gallery outside. Nothing. No one. The 3 keepers had vanished, but they couldn't have simply walked away. The island was surrounded by treacherous seas. The only way off was by boat, and the lighthouse boats were still secured at the landing platform. Moore had seen them on his way up. 3 men, experienced keepers, gone without explanation, without leaving any note, without taking their possessions. Joseph Moore rushed back down the stairs and out to the landing platform. He signaled frantically to Captain Harvey on the Hesperus. The captain, seeing Moore's distress, immediately ordered the ship's horn to be sounded repeatedly, a signal that something was seriously wrong. Within minutes, Captain Harvey and several crew members were climbing the stairs to the lighthouse. When they reached the summit, Moore met them, his face pale, his voice shaking. "They're gone, Captain. All 3 of them. Just gone." Captain James Harvey was a veteran seaman. He had commanded lighthouse tenders for years. He had seen equipment failures, medical emergencies, storm damage, injuries, but he had never encountered anything like this. He organized an immediate and thorough search of the entire island. Every crew member who could be spared from the Hesperus came ashore. They spread across Island Moore, calling out the names of the missing keepers, searching every crevice, every rocky outcrop, every possible location where 3 men might be. The island is not large. Half a mile long, perhaps a quarter-mile wide at its broadest point. It can be traversed in less than an hour, but the terrain is brutal. Volcanic rock, steep cliffs, deep fissures, places where a man could fall and become wedged in rocks, places where a body might lie hidden from casual observation. The searchers checked every such location. They climbed down to the landing platform and examined the steps carefully. They checked the railway track that led from the platform to the lighthouse. They inspected the supply sheds. They looked in the storage cellar. They examined the well from which the keepers drew water. Nothing. No bodies, no blood, no signs of violence or struggle, no indication that anything had happened to the men. As the search continued, Captain Harvey returned to the lighthouse to examine it more carefully. What he found there raised more questions than it answered. Harvey's examination of the lighthouse revealed a strange mixture of normalcy and abandonment. Some things were exactly as they should be, others made no sense at all. The light mechanism itself was in perfect working order. The lenses were clean, the reflectors polished, the fuel reservoirs full, the clockwork mechanism wound and ready. Everything necessary to operate the light was in place and properly maintained. This indicated that the keepers had been performing their duties up until whatever happened. They had not been neglectful. They had not abandoned their responsibilities before the end. The kitchen showed signs of a meal having been prepared but not eaten. Dishes were clean and stacked. The table was set, but no food remained, suggesting either that the keepers had cleaned up after themselves or that they had been interrupted before eating. The keepers' personal belongings remained in their quarters: clothing, books, letters from families, small personal items. These were not men who had planned to leave permanently. If they had known they were departing, they would have packed their possessions. But most puzzling were the oilskins. 2 sets hung on their designated hooks. The 3rd set was missing. This suggested that one keeper, but only one, had put on his waterproof coat before going outside. Why would only one keeper need waterproofs? If they were all going out into weather, wouldn't all 3 have worn protective clothing? Or if conditions were calm enough that waterproofs weren't necessary, why would even one keeper wear them? The logbook provided some clues, but raised even more questions. Every lighthouse keeper was required to maintain a detailed log. Weather conditions, sea state, ships sighted, maintenance performed, equipment status. These logs were official documents, inspected regularly by the Northern Lighthouse Board. James Ducat had been meticulous in his record-keeping. The logbook for early December showed standard, professional entries, weather observations written in clear handwriting, technical notes about lamp maintenance, records of passing vessels. The entries continued normally through December 13th. Then, on December 14th, the entries became unusual. Severe gales, more than usual. Master MacArthur crying. This was strange language for an official logbook. Keepers typically recorded weather objectively, without editorial commentary or references to emotional states. December 15th contained the final entry. Storm ended. Sea calm. God is over all. And then, nothing. The log ended abruptly. No entries for December 16th, 17th, 18th, or any subsequent days. The final entry on December 15th suggested that the storm had passed and conditions had improved. Yet that was the day the Arster noted the light was dark. Captain Harvey stared at these final entries. Something about them felt wrong. The handwriting appeared to be Ducat's. He had been the principal keeper, responsible for maintaining the log, but the tone was unlike his previous entries. The reference to MacArthur crying was completely unprecedented in Lighthouse logs, and the final statement, God is over all, sounded almost like a farewell. Had Ducat known something was about to happen? Was this a veiled message? Or were these the normal entries of a professional keeper who simply stopped writing because what? While the lighthouse itself revealed little, the western side of the island told a different story. And it was there that the search party made their most disturbing discoveries. The Flannan Isle's lighthouse had 2 landing platforms. The main eastern platform, where the Hesperus had docked, was used under normal conditions. But there was also a smaller western landing, built for use when easterly winds made the main platform inaccessible. The western landing consisted of a concrete platform set into the cliff face, accessible via a steep path from the top of the island. A wooden storage box was secured there, containing mooring ropes, landing lines, and other equipment necessary for vessels approaching from the west. When the search party reached the western landing, they found evidence of tremendous violence. Not human violence, but the violence of the sea itself. The iron railings that ran along the path to the landing platform were twisted and bent. These were not light decorative railings. They were heavy industrial ironwork designed to withstand storms. Yet something had warped them, as if they were made of soft wire. The wooden storage box, which had been secured in a crevice above the landing platform, was gone. It weighed perhaps 100 pounds when empty, more when full. It had simply vanished. Most striking of all was a massive boulder that had been moved. This stone, weighing over a ton, had been dislodged from its position and shifted several feet. The force required to move such a boulder was immense, and at the top of the cliff, 810 feet above sea level, there were water stains on the rocks. Salt water had been thrown that high, more than 10 stories above the ocean surface. The implications were clear. A wave of extraordinary size and power had struck the western side of the island. A wave large enough to reach 110 feet up a cliff face, large enough to twist iron railings, large enough to move a 1-ton boulder, large enough to sweep away anything or anyone in its path. As Captain Harvey examined the evidence at the western landing, a theory began to form. It was terrible to contemplate, but it fit the facts. The keepers had noticed something wrong with the western landing platform. Perhaps the storage box had come loose in recent storms. Perhaps they had seen damage to the railings or other equipment. Whatever the specific concern, they had decided to go down and investigate. Professional keepers took equipment security seriously. If mooring ropes were lost or damaged, the cost would be deducted from their pay. More importantly, if a supply ship arrived and couldn't properly secure because equipment was missing, people could die. The keepers had every incentive to ensure all equipment was properly maintained, so they had gone to the western landing. But here's where the theory became complicated. One keeper, almost certainly Donald MacArthur, the newest member of the team, had put on oilskins before going out. This suggested he was the one who was going to actually descend to the landing platform, where spray and waves might wet him. The other 2 would remain at the top, perhaps helping with ropes or simply supervising the work. But something had gone wrong, catastrophically wrong. One scenario is that MacArthur descended to the landing platform while Ducat and Marshall remained above. Then a massive wave struck. A rogue wave, far larger than the surrounding seas. MacArthur down on the platform would have been swept away instantly. Ducat and Marshall, seeing their colleague in danger, rushed down to try to help, and were caught by a subsequent wave. Another scenario is that all 3 went down together, despite 2 not wearing waterproofs. Perhaps the seas appeared calm. Perhaps they misjudged the conditions. Perhaps they were in a hurry, and the wave caught all three at once. A third, more disturbing scenario is that one keeper was swept away, a second tried to rescue him and was also lost, and the third also died trying to save his companions. A cascade of tragedy, each man pulled by duty and loyalty to help his fellows, each meeting the same terrible fate. But was such a wave even possible? The western landing platform was 110 feet above sea level. For a wave to reach that height and strike with enough force to twist iron and move boulders seems almost impossible. Even the most severe storms don't typically produce waves that large in open water. But the Flannan Isles are not open water. The island's cliffs create specific conditions. When a large wave strikes a vertical rock face at the right angle, the water doesn't just break, it shoots upward with tremendous velocity. This phenomenon, known as wave run-up, can send water far higher than the original wave height. Lighthouse keepers in Scotland were familiar with this danger. There were documented cases of waves reaching astonishing heights at cliff-based lighthouses. At the Skerryvore Lighthouse, built on rocks 35 feet above sea level, waves had been recorded reaching 150 feet up the tower, more than 4 times the height of the base. At Untouched in the Shetland Islands, a wave had torn away a metal fog signal that was secured 200 feet above the sea. The force of these waves was almost beyond comprehension. So yes, it was possible. Not common, not predictable, but under the right conditions, with the right combination of swell direction, wind, and tide, a wave could strike the western cliffs of Island Moor and throw water more than 100 feet into the air with enough force to sweep away men, equipment, and massive stones. It was rare, but it was possible. And on December 15, 1900, it appeared to have happened. Captain Harvey completed his search and examination. He had found no survivors, no bodies, no clear evidence of exactly what had happened, but he had found enough to form a working theory. The Hesperus needed to return to Lewis. The lighthouse needed to be manned. Harvey couldn't leave it dark. Too many ships depended on that light for safe passage. Joseph Moore volunteered to stay, along with 2 seamen from the Hesperus. They would maintain the light until permanent replacement keepers could be sent. It was a somber duty. The lighthouse felt haunted now, filled with the absence of the 3 men who had vanished. On December 26, 1900, as the Hesperus prepared to depart, Captain Harvey sent a telegram to the Northern Lighthouse Board. It was terse, official, and utterly inadequate to describe what had been discovered. A dreadful accident has happened at Flannan's. The 3 keepers, Ducat, Marshall, and the Occasional, have disappeared from the island. On our arrival there this afternoon, no sign of life was to be seen on the island. Fired a rocket, but as no response was made, managed to land Moore, who went up to the station but found no keepers there. The clocks were stopped, and other signs indicated that the accident must have happened about a week ago. Poor fellows, they must have been blown over the cliffs or drowned, trying to secure a crane or something like that. The telegram reached Edinburgh that evening, and the investigation began. But 125 years later, despite official inquiries, despite countless theories, despite modern forensic understanding of storms and waves, the exact sequence of events on December 15, 1900, remains unknown. 3 experienced keepers vanished. No witnesses, no bodies, no definitive evidence. Just an empty lighthouse, a dark light, and questions that may never be fully answered. The sea had taken them. Of that, most investigators were certain. But exactly how, exactly when, exactly why 3 professional keepers were all in the wrong place at the wrong time, that remained, and remains, a mystery. Chapter 3. The Investigation, Theories, Grief, and Unanswered Questions. The telegram arrived at the offices of the Northern Lighthouse Board in Edinburgh on the evening of December 26, 1900. Robert Muirhead, the board's superintendent, read Captain Harvey's words with growing disbelief. A dreadful accident has happened at Flannan's. 3 keepers, gone, no bodies, no witnesses, no explanation. Muirhead had overseen lighthouse operations throughout Scotland for nearly 2 decades. He had dealt with equipment failures, medical emergencies, supply problems, personnel conflicts. He had investigated accidents where keepers fell from towers, were injured by machinery, or became ill in remote locations. But he had never encountered anything like this. 3 experienced keepers vanishing simultaneously from a remote island with no indication of what had happened to them. It was unprecedented. It was inexplicable. And most disturbing of all, it suggested that lighthouse work, already dangerous, might contain risks that no one had previously understood. Muirhead knew what he had to do. He had to go to Flannan himself. He had to examine the scene. He had to determine what had happened. And somehow he had to explain to 3 grieving families why their husbands and fathers were never coming home. Before Muirhead could leave for Flannan, he had to perform the most difficult duty any official can face. He had to inform the families that their loved ones were missing and presumed dead. Margaret Ducat received the news at her home in Brascleet on December 27th. She was 41 years old, the mother of 4 children ranging in age from 7 to 16. Her husband James had been a lighthouse keeper for 12 years. It was steady work, difficult work, but respectable work that provided for a family. When the official from the Northern Lighthouse Board knocked on her door, Margaret already knew something was wrong. James should have been relieved from Flannan on the 20th. When the weather had prevented the relief, she had accepted the delay. Bad weather was part of lighthouse life. James would come home when the seas calmed. But when the official explained that James was not at the lighthouse, that he had vanished along with the other 2 keepers, Margaret's world collapsed. "What do you mean, vanished?" she asked, her voice shaking. "James wouldn't just leave his post. He wouldn't abandon the light. Where is he?" The official had no answers, only condolences, only uncertainty, only the terrible limbo of not knowing whether her husband was alive or dead, whether to hope or to mourn. Margaret Ducat's eldest son, also named James, later recalled that day in an interview conducted in the 1950s. "Mother didn't cry at first," he said. "She just stood there, holding onto the doorframe, staring at nothing. Then she said, 'He's not coming back, is he?' And the man from the board said nothing, and we knew." Sarah Marshall received similar news. She was 27 years old, married to Thomas Marshall for only 4 years. They had 2 young children, a daughter aged 3 and a son just 18 months old. Thomas had been excited about his posting to Flannan. It was a prestigious station, and the pay was good. He had written to Sarah about the magnificent lighthouse, the challenging seas, the satisfaction of keeping the light burning. His last letter had arrived on December 10th. He had written about the approaching winter, about hoping the relief would come on schedule, about missing his children. The letter ended, "Give my love to the little ones. Tell them their father will be home soon. All my love, Thomas." When Sarah learned he was missing, she refused to believe he was dead. "Thomas is too careful," she insisted. "He wouldn't do anything foolish. He's somewhere. He must be somewhere." She clung to hope long after hope was reasonable, writing letters to the Northern Lighthouse Board demanding further searches, insisting that the keepers must have been taken somewhere, must be alive on another island, must be findable if only people would look hard enough. Her hope was heartbreaking, and it was understandable. How do you accept that someone you love has simply vanished? How do you grieve without a body? How do you explain to small children that their father is gone but no one knows where or why? Donald MacArthur's wife, Minnie, faced the same terrible uncertainty, but her situation was complicated by guilt. Donald had taken the December posting to Flannan as a temporary replacement for William Ross, who was on sick leave. Donald had not wanted to go. Flannan in December was known to be brutal, but the board needed someone experienced, and Donald had accepted the assignment out of duty. "He did it for the money," Minnie told investigators later. "Christmas was coming. We had 2 children. The extra pay for a holiday rotation would help. He said it would only be 2 weeks, maybe 3, if weather delayed the relief. He said he'd be home for Hogmanay, Scottish New Year's celebration." Donald MacArthur never made it home for Hogmanay, never celebrated another New Year, never saw his children grow up. He had accepted an assignment to help a colleague, and it had cost him his life. The guilt Minnie felt, irrational but real, haunted her for decades. If Donald had refused the assignment, he would still be alive. If Ross had not been ill, Donald would not have gone. If, the endless what-ifs of grief with no closure. Robert Muirhead departed for Flannan on December 29th aboard the lighthouse tender Hesperus. He took with him 2 experienced lighthouse engineers and detailed instructions from the board to determine exactly what had happened. The weather was rough. The journey took longer than usual. But finally, on December 29th, Muirhead climbed the 160 steps to the lighthouse that Joseph Moore had climbed just 3 days earlier. Muirhead was a methodical man. He had trained as an engineer before joining the Northern Lighthouse Board. He approached problems systematically, gathering evidence, forming hypotheses, testing theories. He would apply the same approach to the Flannan mystery. He began inside the lighthouse. Every room was examined, every piece of equipment inspected, every surface scrutinized for clues. The lighthouse itself was in perfect order. The lamps had been cleaned and refilled. The lens mechanisms were properly maintained. The fuel stores were adequate. The living quarters were neat. The kitchen was clean. Everything suggested that the keepers had been performing their duties properly up until whatever happened. But there were anomalies, small details that didn't quite fit the pattern of normal operations. The clock had stopped at 8:45. Was this morning or evening? If morning, it suggested the keepers had been gone since before dawn, on the day the light went dark. If evening, it might indicate they vanished after sunset. But why would all 3 keepers leave the lighthouse after dark? That would mean leaving the light unattended during operating hours, something professional keepers simply did not do. The oilskins. 2 sets hung on their hooks. 1 set was missing. This suggested that one keeper had put on waterproof gear while the other 2 had not. Why? If they were all going outside into dangerous conditions, wouldn't all 3 wear protective clothing? If conditions were calm, why would even one keeper need oilskins? The table was set, but no food remained on plates. Had the keepers eaten and cleaned up? Or had they been interrupted before eating? The kitchen gave no clear answer. Most puzzling was the logbook. Muirhead read the final entries carefully. The handwriting appeared to be Ducat's. He recognized the principal keeper's distinctive script from previous logbooks. December 12th. Severe winds from the west. Sea extremely rough. December 13th. Gale continuing, no vessels sighted. Standard entries. Professional. Exactly what one would expect from an experienced keeper. But then December 14th. Storm ended. Sea calm. God is over all. That final phrase troubled Muirhead. It was not the language of a routine logbook entry. It sounded like, what? A prayer? A farewell? A statement of resignation to fate? And crucially, if the storm had ended on December 14th and the sea was calm, why was the light dark on December 15th? What had happened in those intervening hours? Muirhead moved his investigation outside. The western landing platform revealed the most dramatic evidence: the twisted iron railings, the missing storage box, the displaced boulder, the water stains 110 feet above sea level. All of this pointed to a wave of extraordinary power striking the western side of the island. But when? Weather records from Lewis and other nearby locations showed that while December 12th and 13th had seen severe gales, conditions on December 14th and 15th had been improving. There were no reports of the kind of extreme storm that would generate waves capable of reaching 110 feet up a cliff face. Yet the physical evidence was undeniable. A massive wave, or series of waves, had struck the western landing. The force required to twist industrial ironwork and move a 1-ton boulder was immense. If the keepers had been at that landing when such a wave hit, they would have been swept away instantly, with no chance of survival. Muirhead formed his theory. The keepers had noticed something wrong at the western landing, probably the storage box coming loose or damage to equipment. They had gone to investigate or repair the problem. While they were there, a rogue wave had struck, sweeping all 3 men into the sea. It was the most logical explanation, but it raised more questions than it answered. Muirhead's wave theory made sense, but several aspects of the case didn't fit neatly into that explanation. First, the timing. If the wave struck on December 14th, when storms were still raging, why did Ducat write that the sea was calm? Experienced keepers didn't confuse rough seas with calm ones. If he wrote calm, he meant calm. If the wave struck on December 15th during the improved conditions, where did it come from? Rogue waves do occur, massive swells that appear seemingly from nowhere, far larger than surrounding seas. But they are extremely rare. The probability of one striking Flannan at the exact moment 3 keepers happened to be at the western landing seemed almost impossibly low. Second, the protocol. Lighthouse regulations were clear. At least 1 keeper should remain inside the lighthouse at all times. This rule existed for exactly this reason, to prevent all 3 keepers from being in danger simultaneously. Ducat, with 12 years of experience, knew this rule intimately. Why would he allow all 3 men to go to the western landing together? One possible answer: if there was an emergency, if one keeper was in immediate danger, the others might abandon protocol to attempt a rescue. Perhaps MacArthur, wearing his oilskins, had gone down to the landing alone. Perhaps he had slipped or been struck by a smaller wave and fallen into the water. Perhaps Ducat and Marshall, seeing him in trouble, rushed down without taking time to put on their own waterproofs. Perhaps all 3 died trying to save each other. This scenario was emotionally compelling. It fit with what was known about the keepers' characters. All 3 were described as responsible, caring men who took their duties seriously. The idea that they died trying to help each other had a tragic nobility to it. But it was speculation. There were no witnesses, no survivors, no way to know for certain. Third, the missing bodies. The Atlantic around Flannan is cold and dangerous. Bodies swept into those waters might never be recovered, carried away by currents, pulled down by cold water, lost in the vast ocean. Yet over the following weeks and months, not a single trace of the 3 keepers was ever found. No bodies washed ashore on Flannan or nearby islands. No personal items. No fragments of clothing. Nothing. It was as if the three men had simply ceased to exist at a specific moment in time. Muirhead completed his investigation on January 8, 1901. His official report to the Northern Lighthouse Board was thorough, professional, and ultimately unsatisfying. He presented the evidence. He outlined the most probable theory. But he could not provide certainty. The report concluded, "I am of the opinion that the most likely explanation is that the men had gone down on the afternoon of Saturday, 15th of December, to the proximity of the West Landing to secure the box with the mooring ropes, etc., and that an unexpectedly large roller had come up on the island, and a large body of water, going up higher than where they were, and coming down upon them, had swept them completely away." Most likely. The words of a careful investigator, unwilling to claim certainty where none existed. The Northern Lighthouse Board accepted Muirhead's report. Officially, the case was closed. The three keepers had died in an accident related to unexpectedly severe wave action. It was a tragedy, but an explicable tragedy within the known dangers of lighthouse work. 3 widows and 8 fatherless children received modest pensions from the board. Memorial services were held. The keepers were mourned. Life moved on, but questions remained. And as the years passed, the mystery of Flannan only deepened. In the absence of certainty, speculation flourished. Over the following decades, various alternative theories emerged about what had happened at Flannan. Some suggested murder. Perhaps one keeper had gone mad from isolation and killed the others, then committed suicide by jumping into the sea. But this theory had no supporting evidence. The lighthouse showed no signs of violence or struggle, and psychological profiles of the keepers, all experienced, stable men, made the madness explanation unlikely. Others proposed accident and panic. Perhaps one keeper had fallen and been badly injured. Perhaps the other 2 had tried to get him to the landing platform for emergency evacuation. Perhaps in their panic they had all made mistakes that led to all 3 being swept away. This was possible, but why would they attempt evacuation in rough seas rather than waiting for the scheduled relief just days away? Still others whispered about the supernatural. The Flannan Isles had been associated with mystery even before the lighthouse was built. Local Gaelic legend spoke of strange happenings on Island Moor. Some believed the islands were cursed. Some claimed that spirits or creatures from the sea had taken the keepers. These supernatural theories were, of course, unprovable and scientifically unsupportable, but they reflected something important: the human need to explain the inexplicable. When facts are insufficient, stories emerge to fill the void. The Flannan mystery never faded. It became embedded in Scottish folklore, a cautionary tale about the dangers of the sea and the mysteries that remain unsolved. In 1912, poet Wilfred Wilson Gibson published Flannan Isle, a haunting poem that captured the eeriness of the discovery. "Though 3 men dwell on Flannan Isle to keep the lamp alight, as we steered under the lee, we caught no glimmer through the night." The poem ends with the chilling lines, "We seemed to stand for an endless while, though still no word was said, 3 men alive on Flannan Isle who thought on 3 men dead." Gibson's poem took liberties with the facts. The logbook entries he described were largely fictional, but his verses captured something true: the profound unease created by sudden, unexplained disappearance. Over the following century, the mystery inspired books, films, documentaries, and endless speculation. Each generation rediscovered the story, applied new theories, searched for new explanations. But the fundamental mystery remained. On some day in mid-December 1900, most likely December 15th, 3 experienced lighthouse keepers vanished from a remote Scottish island. Despite extensive investigation, despite modern forensic understanding, despite decades of speculation and research, no one has ever definitively explained what happened to James Ducat, Thomas Marshall, and Donald MacArthur. The sea took them. Of that, most experts remain convinced. But exactly how, exactly when, exactly why, 3 professional keepers were all in the wrong place at the wrong moment. That remains one of maritime history's most enduring mysteries. And perhaps in the end, that's what makes the Flannan Isles case so compelling. Not the sensational theories, not the supernatural speculation, but the simple, terrible reality that sometimes people vanish, and no amount of investigation can bring them back or explain what happened. The lighthouse still stands on Island Moor. Automated now, no longer requiring keepers to risk their lives maintaining the light. But on winter nights, when storms sweep across the Atlantic, locals still speak of the 3 men who disappeared. Still wonder what they saw in their final moments. Still hope that somehow, someday, the mystery will be solved. But 125 years later, the silence remains, and the questions endure. Chapter 4: The Theories, Science, Speculation, and the Search for Truth. In the decades following the disappearance, the Flannan Isles mystery refused to fade. Each generation rediscovered the story, applied contemporary understanding to the evidence, and developed new theories about what might have happened on December 15th, 1900. Some theories were grounded in science, attempts to understand the physics of waves, the psychology of isolation, the specific conditions that could lead to 3 experienced keepers being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Other theories ventured into speculation, conspiracy, and even the supernatural. But underlying all these theories was a fundamental human need: the need to understand, the need to explain, the need to believe that even the most mysterious disappearances have rational causes that can be discovered if only we look hard enough. This is the story of how generations of investigators, scientists, writers, and amateur detectives tried to solve a mystery that has defied solution for 125 years. The official explanation, that a massive wave swept the keepers away, seems straightforward. But when oceanographers and maritime engineers examined the case in detail, they discovered layers of complexity that made the simple explanation less simple than it appeared. Dr. James Lighthill, a prominent fluid dynamics expert who studied the case in the 1960s, calculated the forces required to bend the iron railings and move the 1-ton boulder at the western landing. His conclusion: a wave would need to strike with approximately 7,000 pounds per square foot of pressure. This was within the realm of possibility for extreme conditions, but it required specific circumstances. The phenomenon is called wave run-up. When a wave strikes a vertical or near-vertical cliff face, the water doesn't just break, it shoots upward with tremendous velocity. The energy of the horizontal wave motion is converted into vertical motion. Under the right conditions, this can send water far higher than the original wave height. At Flannan, the western cliffs rise nearly vertically from deep water. This geography creates ideal conditions for extreme wave run-up. Mathematical models developed in the 1970s showed that a wave of 40-50 feet striking the cliff at the correct angle could theoretically produce run-up reaching 100-150 feet above sea level. But here's where the theory becomes complicated. For such a wave to occur on December 15, 1900, several factors would need to align perfectly. First, a massive swell from a distant storm. Even though local conditions around the Flannan Isles had improved by December 15th, storms hundreds of miles away in the Atlantic could generate swells that traveled vast distances. These swells could arrive at Flannan hours, or even days, after the generating storm had passed, appearing seemingly from nowhere under otherwise calm conditions. Second, the swell would need to approach from precisely the right direction. The western cliffs of Island Moor face southwest. A swell approaching from that specific direction would strike the cliffs at the angle most likely to produce extreme run-up. Third, the swell would need to interact with the underwater topography in exactly the right way. The seabed near Flannan is complex, with underwater ridges and valleys that can focus wave energy, much like a lens focuses light. Under specific conditions, these underwater features can create rogue waves, massive individual waves far larger than the surrounding sea. Fourth, and most critically, the 3 keepers would need to be at the western landing at the exact moment this wave struck. Given that waves travel at speeds of 20 to 40 miles per hour, they would have had perhaps 10-20 seconds of warning, the time it takes for a visible swell to travel from the horizon to the cliff face. Not enough time to escape if they were at the landing platform itself. The probability of all these factors aligning simultaneously seemed almost impossibly low. Yet maritime records contain numerous examples of similarly improbable wave events. At the Untouched Lighthouse in Shetland, a wave had torn away equipment secured 200 feet above sea level. At the Fastnet Rock Lighthouse off Ireland, waves had shattered windows 150 feet up. At the Eddystone Lighthouse off Cornwall, waves had knocked the entire structure, which weighed over 4,000 tons, off its foundation. The ocean was capable of forces that defied normal expectations. Rogue waves, once dismissed as sailors' legends, have been documented by modern oceanographic instruments. In 1995, a wave measuring 84 feet high was recorded striking an oil platform in the North Sea, appearing suddenly from seas with average wave heights of only 40 feet. So yes, a massive wave could have struck Flannan on December 15, 1900. It was rare, it was unlikely, but it was possible. And if the keepers happened to be at the western landing when it struck, they would have had no chance of survival. But this raised the question that had troubled investigators from the beginning. Why would all 3 keepers be at the western landing simultaneously? Lighthouse regulations were explicit. At least one keeper must remain inside the lighthouse at all times. This rule existed precisely to prevent situations where all 3 men could be endangered simultaneously. James Ducat, with 12 years of experience, knew this rule intimately. He had helped write similar regulations for other lighthouses. Yet the evidence suggested that all 3 men had gone to the landing together. 2 sets of boots and oilskins were missing from inside the lighthouse. The lighthouse had been left completely unattended, the light dark, the mechanism unwound, no one inside. In the 1980s, lighthouse historian James Love proposed what he called the Cascade Rescue Theory. His scenario went like this. Donald MacArthur, wearing oilskins, goes down to the western landing alone to check on the mooring equipment. This is his job as the junior keeper. Ducat and Marshall remain inside, following protocol. But then MacArthur encounters trouble. Perhaps he slips. Perhaps a smaller wave knocks him down. Perhaps he becomes trapped or injured. Marshall sees this from the lighthouse window. Without thinking, without taking time to put on his own oilskins, he rushes out to help. Ducat, seeing Marshall running toward danger, follows immediately. They reach the landing just as a massive wave strikes. All 3 are swept away in seconds. This scenario was emotionally compelling. It explained why protocol was broken, not through negligence, but through the human instinct to help someone in danger. It explained why MacArthur was wearing oilskins, while the others were not. He had been the only one planning to go outside. It explained why the lighthouse was abandoned. The emergency had happened so quickly that there was no time for careful planning. But it was still speculation. There were no witnesses, no way to verify what had actually happened. An alternative theory, proposed by maritime psychologist Dr. Helen Morrison in the 1990s, suggested group decision-making failure. Morrison argued that isolation and routine could lead to what she called normalization of risk. The keepers had seen rough seas countless times. They had checked the landing platforms in all kinds of weather. Over time, they might have developed an unconscious confidence that they could handle any conditions. On December 15th, seeing that the storm had passed and conditions were improving, they might have collectively decided to check the western landing for damage. Perhaps they discussed it. Perhaps they agreed it would be faster and safer if all 3 went together. 1 to descend to the platform, 2 to remain at the top with safety ropes. Perhaps they believed they were being careful. And then the rogue wave appeared, traveling faster than they expected, rising higher than they anticipated, striking before they could react. Morrison's theory had one advantage. It didn't require anyone to make an obviously foolish decision. Instead, it suggested that 3 intelligent, experienced men made a decision that seemed reasonable at the time, but had catastrophic consequences. This fit with what we know about accidents generally. They rarely result from single stupid choices, but rather from chains of small decisions that align in unfortunate ways. Not all theories about Flannan focused on natural causes. Some investigators, unsatisfied with the wave explanation, proposed more sinister scenarios. The murder-suicide theory emerged in the 1920s and periodically resurfaced. This theory suggested that Donald MacArthur, the newest and least experienced keeper, had suffered a psychological break due to isolation. In a fit of madness, he had killed Ducat and Marshall, then thrown himself into the sea in remorse. But this theory had fatal flaws. First, there was no evidence of violence at the lighthouse, no blood, no signs of struggle, no damage consistent with a fight. Second, MacArthur's psychological profile, based on employment records and testimonials from colleagues, showed no indication of mental instability. Third, the timeline made no sense. If MacArthur had killed the others inside the lighthouse, why would their oilskins be missing? If he had lured them outside to kill them, how did he overpower 2 larger, stronger men? The theory persisted primarily because it offered a human explanation for an otherwise inexplicable event. People murdered each other. People went mad. These were understandable, if tragic, human behaviors. A massive wave appearing from nowhere on a calm day seemed somehow less believable. Another dark theory, whispered rather than openly discussed, involved espionage or foul play by outsiders. In 1900, Britain was engaged in the Boer War in South Africa. Some theorized that foreign agents had landed on Flannan, captured or killed the keepers, and disabled the lighthouse to interfere with British shipping. But this theory made little sense. Flannan was extremely remote and difficult to access. There were much easier ways to interfere with shipping, and no foreign power claimed credit or showed any indication of involvement. A variation on this theory, popular in the 1950s during the Cold War era, suggested Soviet submarines or spies. But the Flannan disappearance occurred in 1900, 17 years before the Russian Revolution. The Soviet Union didn't exist yet. These theories revealed more about the anxieties of the eras in which they emerged than about what actually happened at Flannan. They were projections of contemporary fears onto a historical mystery, And then there were the theories that ventured beyond the physical world entirely. The Flannan Isles had been associated with mystery and legend long before the lighthouse was built. Local Gaelic traditions spoke of the islands as special places associated with St. Flannan and inhabited by spirits. After the keeper's disappearance, some locals whispered that the islands had been angry about the lighthouse, that human presence had disturbed something that should have been left alone, that the keepers had been taken as punishment for trespassing on sacred ground. These beliefs were ancient, predating Christianity. They reflected a worldview in which certain places possessed power or consciousness, in which the boundary between the physical and spiritual worlds was permeable, in which human arrogance could provoke supernatural retribution. In 1912, Wilfred Wilson Gibson's poem, Flannan Isle, gave literary voice to these supernatural suggestions. In Gibson's version, the keepers found something on the island, something that disturbed them deeply. The poem contains fictional log entries describing terror and inexplicable events. These entries were pure invention. They never appeared in the actual logbook. But Gibson's poem was so widely read that many people came to believe the fictional entries were real. By the 1920s, books and articles about Flannan often included descriptions of mysterious log entries, mentioning storms that shouldn't exist, strange sounds, visions, terror. None of this appeared in the actual records, but the fictional accounts became so embedded in popular consciousness that they overshadowed the real evidence. This process, the transformation of a real tragedy into supernatural legend, illustrated how mysteries become myths. Facts were insufficient to satisfy the human hunger for meaning, so stories were created, embellished, repeated, until they seemed more true than truth itself. In the 1970s, during a period of renewed interest in paranormal phenomena, some writers suggested UFO abduction. In the 1990s, others proposed parallel dimensions or time slips. In the 2000s, internet forums generated theories involving secret government experiments, underwater bases, and elaborate conspiracies. None of these theories had any supporting evidence, but they filled a psychological need, the need for extraordinary explanations for extraordinary events. A simple wave seemed insufficient to explain such a complete disappearance. There had to be more. There had to be mystery beyond mere physics. In recent years, advances in forensic science and oceanography have allowed new analysis of the Flannan case. In 2005, a team from the University of Aberdeen used computer modeling to simulate wave conditions at Flannan under various scenarios. Their conclusions supported the wave theory but added important nuance. The models showed that extreme wave run-up at the western landing was rare, but not impossibly so. Under the right conditions, a large Atlantic swell approaching from the southwest, striking at an angle of approximately 30 degrees to the cliff face, interacting with specific underwater topography, waves could indeed reach heights of 100 to 150 feet at the landing location. The model also revealed something unexpected. Once every 10-20 years, conditions align such that a series of waves, not just one, strike in rapid succession, each larger than the previous. This wave train phenomenon could explain why all three keepers were caught. Perhaps they had seen the first wave and thought they were safe. Perhaps they began to retreat. And then the second, larger wave struck before they could reach safety. DNA analysis of hair samples from the keepers' personal effects, preserved by family members, was attempted in 2011 to see if any trace evidence might be found in archived material from the lighthouse. But no usable forensic evidence was recovered. After more than a century, the physical evidence had degraded beyond the point where modern techniques could extract new information. Psychological profiling of the keepers, based on their letters, employment records, and testimonials from colleagues, found no indication of mental instability, interpersonal conflict, or risk-taking behavior. All three men appeared to be exactly what their records suggested: competent, cautious, professional lighthouse keepers who understood the dangers of their work. Despite 125 years of investigation, analysis, and speculation, the Flannan Isles mystery remains fundamentally unsolved. We know that 3 men disappeared. We know approximately when. We can make educated guesses about how, but we cannot know with certainty exactly what happened in those final moments. The wave theory remains the most scientifically plausible explanation. It fits the physical evidence. It aligns with what we know about ocean dynamics. It explains the damage at the western landing and the missing keepers. But it doesn't explain everything. It doesn't explain why protocol was broken. It doesn't explain the precise sequence of events that put all 3 men in danger simultaneously. It doesn't explain why the bodies were never recovered. And perhaps that's the real lesson of Flannan. Not every mystery has a solution. Not every question has an answer. Sometimes, despite our best efforts, despite our technological capabilities, despite our determination to understand, some events remain inexplicable. 3 men vanished. The sea took them. How and why exactly we may never know. And perhaps after 125 years, we must accept that uncertainty. Must live with not knowing. Must acknowledge that some mysteries endure, not because the truth is hidden, but because the truth was witnessed by no one who survived to tell it. Chapter 5. The Lighthouse Stands Alone. Legacy of the Vanished. The Flannan Isles. Lighthouse still stands on Island Moor 125 years after 3 men vanished from its keeping. The light still burns, though now automated, requiring no human presence. The 160 steps carved into the cliff face remain, weathered by more than a century of Atlantic storms. The iron railings at the western landing, twisted by that mysterious wave in December 1900, were replaced decades ago, but the scars in the rock remain. The lighthouse endures. But the mystery endures as well. This is the story of what happened after the disappearance, how the lighthouse continued to operate, how the families of the vanished keepers lived with uncertainty, how the mystery transformed from tragedy into legend, and how, more than a century later, the case of the Flannan Isles continues to haunt us. On December 27, 1900, Joseph Moore lit the lamp at Flannan Isle's lighthouse for the first time since the disappearance. He was assisted by 2 seamen from the Hesperus, neither of them trained lighthouse keepers, both of them acutely aware that they were maintaining a light in a place where 3 experienced men had just vanished. Moore later described those first nights as the most difficult of his life. Every sound made him jump. Every shadow seemed to hold menace. The lighthouse felt different now, not haunted in any supernatural sense, but heavy with absence. The silence where there should have been voices, the empty chairs, the unworn coats hanging on their hooks. I kept expecting them to walk through the door, Moore told an interviewer years later. My mind knew they were gone, but my heart kept listening for their footsteps. Within a week, permanent replacement keepers arrived. The Northern Lighthouse Board moved quickly to staff Flannan, understanding that the light could not remain dark. But finding keepers willing to serve at the island where 3 men had mysteriously vanished proved challenging. The board offered increased pay. They emphasized the importance of the light. They assured prospective keepers that the disappearance had been a freak accident unlikely to ever recur. Eventually, they found volunteers, men who needed the work, men who were skeptical of the mystery, men who were brave enough to face the isolation despite the tragedy that had occurred there. Over the following decades, hundreds of keepers served at Flannan. Most completed their rotations without incident, but the lighthouse maintained its reputation as one of the most challenging and unsettling postings in the Scottish Lighthouse Service. Keepers reported nothing supernatural, no ghosts, no mysterious phenomena, but they spoke of a pervasive sense of unease, the knowledge that you were sleeping in beds where 3 men had slept before vanishing, walking the same paths, maintaining the same light, always wondering if what happened to them might happen to you. In 1971, the lighthouse was automated. The last human keepers departed, and Flannan became one of many remote Scottish lighthouses operated by machinery rather than people. The automation was driven by economics and technology, not by the historical tragedy. But many saw symbolic significance in the timing. After 71 years of human presence following the disappearance, the lighthouse was finally abandoned to machinery and silence. For the families of James Ducat, Thomas Marshall, and Donald MacArthur, the mystery was not academic or historical. It was personal and immediate. It was the absence at the dinner table, the empty chair, the children asking when father would come home. Margaret Ducat lived until 1936, 36 years after her husband vanished. She never remarried. She raised her 4 children alone, supported by the modest pension from the Northern Lighthouse Board and by work she took in as a seamstress. Her eldest son, James, entered the lighthouse service himself, eventually becoming a principal keeper, following in his father's footsteps despite the family tragedy. Mother never spoke much about what happened, James Ducat Jr. said in a 1952 interview. I asked her once if she believed father had suffered, and she said she hoped he hadn't had time to be afraid, that he had died quickly, doing his duty. That was important to her, that he had died as a lighthouse keeper should, maintaining the light. Sarah Marshall struggled more visibly with the loss. Her insistence that Thomas might still be alive, might be on another island, might have lost his memory, might somehow return, persisted for years. She wrote letters to shipping companies, to other lighthouse stations, to naval authorities, asking if anyone had seen a man matching Thomas's description. In 1905, 5 years after the disappearance, she finally accepted that he was gone. She placed a memorial stone in the churchyard at Brascleet, inscribed, Thomas Marshall, lost at sea, December 1900, beloved husband and father, gone but never forgotten. She lived until 1948. Her daughter later said that Sarah kept all of Thomas's letters, reading them periodically throughout her life. The final letter, "Give my love to the little ones. Tell them their father will be home soon." She kept in a frame beside her bed until the day she died. Minnie MacArthur, Donald's widow, left Lewis entirely. The island held too many painful memories. She moved to Glasgow with her 2 children, found work in a factory, and rarely spoke of her husband's disappearance. When her children asked about their father, she told them simply, "He was a brave man who died doing important work. Be proud of him." All 3 women faced a particular cruelty of uncertainty. Without bodies, without witnesses, without definitive knowledge of what had happened, they could never fully grieve. There was always a small, irrational hope. What if the official explanation was wrong? What if somehow, impossibly, their husbands were alive somewhere? This is the special torture of those who lose loved ones to mysterious disappearance. The inability to achieve closure, the perpetual wondering, the questions that can never be answered. The Flannan Isles mystery entered popular culture almost immediately. Within months of the disappearance, newspaper articles were speculating about supernatural causes. Within years, the story had become a staple of Scottish folklore. By 1912, it had inspired Wilfred Wilson Gibson's famous poem. Throughout the 20th century, the mystery appeared in countless books, articles, radio programs, and documentaries. Some treatments were serious and respectful, careful examinations of the evidence, sober speculation about what might have happened. Others were sensationalized, lurid accounts emphasizing the most dramatic theories, inventing details for dramatic effect, transforming tragedy into entertainment. The story appealed to something fundamental in human psychology: our fascination with unsolved mysteries, our fear of the unknown, our desire to make sense of senseless events. The Flannan Isles case had everything: isolation, disappearance, mystery, and just enough ambiguity to fuel endless speculation. In 2018, a film called The Vanishing used the Flannan case as inspiration for a fictional thriller involving conspiracy and violence. The film took extreme liberties with the facts, inventing dramatic conflicts that had no basis in historical reality. But it introduced the mystery to a new generation, ensuring that the story would continue to be told. This cultural immortality came at a cost. The real James Ducat, Thomas Marshall, and Donald MacArthur, the actual human beings who lived, worked, and died, became increasingly obscured by myth. They transformed from people into characters. Their tragedy became a story. Their deaths became entertainment. Yet perhaps this is inevitable. Perhaps this is how history works. Real events become narratives. Narratives become legends. Legends become myths. And in becoming myths, the original truths are both preserved and transformed. After 125 years of investigation and speculation, what can we say with certainty about what happened at Flannan? We know that on or around December 15, 1900, 3 lighthouse keepers, James Ducat, Thomas Marshall, and Donald MacArthur, vanished from Island Moor. We know that they left behind a lighthouse in good order, with all equipment properly maintained. We know that 2 sets of oilskins remained in the lighthouse, while 1 set was missing. We know that the western landing showed evidence of damage from a massive wave or waves. We know that despite extensive searches, no bodies were ever found. We know that the families received modest pensions, but no definitive answers. We know that the lighthouse continued to operate for another 71 years before being automated. Beyond these facts, we enter the realm of probability and speculation. The most likely explanation, supported by the physical evidence and consistent with known oceanographic phenomena, is that the keepers were at the western landing when an exceptionally large wave struck, sweeping all 3 into the sea. But we cannot know for certain why all 3 were at that landing simultaneously. We cannot know the exact sequence of events. We cannot know whether they saw the wave coming or were taken completely by surprise. We cannot know their final thoughts or words. These unknowns are not failures of investigation. They are simply the limits of what can be reconstructed from historical evidence. Some events leave insufficient traces to permit complete understanding. This is one of them. Perhaps the most important question is not what happened, but why we care. Why does a 125-year-old tragedy involving 3 men whose names most people have never heard continue to fascinate us? Part of the answer is human empathy. We imagine ourselves in the keeper's situation, isolated on a remote island, maintaining an essential service, suddenly confronted with deadly danger. We wonder how we would react, whether we would make the same decisions they made, whether we would survive where they did not. Part of the answer is existential uncertainty. The Flannan case reminds us that life is fragile and unpredictable, that even experienced professionals doing everything right can encounter situations beyond their control. That tragedy can strike without warning or explanation. This is uncomfortable to contemplate, but it is true. And part of the answer is the fundamental mystery itself. In an age where we have mapped the ocean floor, sequenced the human genome, and sent probes to the edge of the solar system, we like to believe that all mysteries can be solved. The Flannan case challenges that belief. It reminds us that some questions may never be answered, that some events may remain forever inexplicable. This is both troubling and strangely comforting. Troubling because we want certainty, comforting because mystery reminds us that the world is larger and stranger than our current understanding, that there are still things we don't know, that reality resists complete explanation. Today, the Flannan Isles remain as remote and inhospitable as they were in 1900. The lighthouse still functions, its automated light sweeping across the Atlantic every night, warning ships away from the dangerous rocks. But no humans live there. No one climbs those 160 steps daily. No one maintains watch through long winter nights. Occasionally, maintenance workers visit by helicopter to service the automated equipment. They report that the lighthouse is well preserved, a monument to Victorian engineering. The keepers' quarters remain largely as they were, simple rooms with basic furniture, now empty and silent. The western landing where the wave struck still shows scars in the rock. The railings have been replaced, but the stone remembers. And on calm days, visitors report, you can stand at that landing and imagine what it must have been like. The view unchanged from what Ducat, Marshall, and MacArthur saw. The sound of waves the same, the isolation absolute. In 2000, on the centennial of the disappearance, a memorial plaque was placed at the lighthouse. It reads simply, "In memory of James Ducat, Thomas Marshall, and Donald MacArthur, lighthouse keepers, who vanished from this station December 1900. They kept the light burning. They are not forgotten." It is a small memorial for a large mystery, but perhaps that's appropriate. The keepers didn't seek fame or legend. They sought only to do their jobs, to maintain the light, to warn ships away from danger, to serve faithfully in one of the most isolated and challenging posts in the British Isles. They succeeded in that duty until the very end, and when they vanished, they left behind a functioning lighthouse with the light properly maintained. Whatever happened in their final moments, they died as lighthouse keepers, doing their duty, serving mariners they would never meet, keeping the light burning against the darkness. The mystery may never be solved. The questions may never be answered. But James Ducat, Thomas Marshall, and Donald MacArthur are remembered. Not as characters in a mystery, not as supernatural legends, but as real men who served with dedication and died in service. The lighthouse stands alone on Island Moor. But it does not stand forgotten, and neither do the three keepers who vanished into mystery 125 years ago. Their light still burns.